Chapter 20. Resolutions. 1 year was coming to an end. The next had yet to begin. At Gurley's place, Brock waited in the booth up front by the window, the only occupied seat in the entire restaurant. The streets outside were empty too. Most everyone else in Daleville was home with family. According to the red neon diner clock, it was only 7, but the skies were completely dark. Being just past the winter solstice, the shortest light of the year, the sun had already set over the last day of 2001. Gurley didn't mind that she had a customer past the posted closing time. She lived in a small apartment above the business, so her commute was minimal. And anyway, it was nice to have someone to talk to. Her husband had died a few years back, and the regulars were like her kinsfolk now. Wisteria had been stopping by weekly before she went off to college, and, well, any friend of hers. Gurley brought Brock a porcelain mug of hot chocolate. "On the house," she said. "Gurley, come on now." "I insist," she said, sweeping a few crumbs from the corner of the table. "I hope Wisteria hurries herself up. This snow's not going to quit any time soon." Outside, the flakes were swirling through the pale orange cone of a streetlight above Brock's truck. There were already drifts, and Daleville didn't like to spend a whole lot of money on plowing. Sometimes the streets and sidewalks just stayed snow-covered until the next thaw. "Got any New Year's resolutions?" Gurley asked. Brock motioned for her to sit, and she pulled up a chair to the end of the table. "Not yet," he said. "I've been trying to figure that out. I sure would like to lose about 30 pounds, but tasting all them rhubarb pies to be sure they turned out all right might make that a problem." Gurley laughed. Brock smiled, but then turned serious again. "Hey, Gurley," he asked, "how do you stay so happy all the time? What's your secret?" "Ha!" she said. "I'm not happy all the time." "Seems like it." "That's just my customer service face. Nobody wants to eat at a restaurant where the owner dumps all her problems on the customers. It's supposed to be the other way around, so what's bothering you then?" "I don't know." Brock took a sip of hot chocolate. "Everything. Nothing works out the way it should. And all the bad stuff that's happening in the world, I can't fix it. I can't figure it out." "Well, why do you think you have to fix everything in the world?" "Huh. When I was a kid, they gave me this test. An IQ test. They said I was a genius. Skipped me ahead a grade." Gurley nodded. "That's a lot of responsibility." "Yeah, and what have I done with this genius intellect? Nothing. I don't even know what I should be doing with my own life." Gurley patted Brock's hand. "I think you're being too hard on yourself. Besides, I'm 62 years old and I'm still trying to figure everything out. You got plenty of time to work on that." "I don't know. That's the problem. I mean, I can't even count on being alive tomorrow." "Sounds like you got it bad, hon. Wish I knew what to tell you." The little bell above the front door tinkled, and Wisteria blew in, along with a gust of wind and a swirl of snowflakes. She stomped the snow from her boots onto the rug and rushed into Gurley's arms for a hug. "Missed you, lady," Gurley told her. "What's the outfit today?" Wisteria unbuttoned her parka to show off a long turquoise dress with cut velvet flower patterns overlaid. The only items betraying a thought that she might have just stepped out of a time machine were her heavy, modern snow boots. She threw the parka over a hook on the coat rack and whirled like a model. "Would you look at that?" Gurley said approvingly. "I think that's from even before this old girl's time." "It's from the 1930s or so." "Well, you look beautiful always." Gurley embraced Wisteria again and whispered something into her ear. Then she headed for the kitchen. "I'm going to clean up and then go watch the late shows. You two stay as long as you want." Wisteria slipped into the booth opposite Brock. "Happy New Year's," she said. "Same to you. When are you headed back to school?" "Day after tomorrow. Second semester starts." "You figure out what you want to major in yet?" "I'm going to do general studies for a while. There's so many things I want to try. I really have no idea." Brock nodded. "But you're going to stick to your schedule, right? You're going to do all your work?" I'm gonna try, man. Wisteria grabbed Brock's hand tightly and trained her wide, surprised-looking eyes on his. Do it. I haven't been helping you out for nothing. All right. Feeling better? A little. Maybe. Panic attacks haven't been as frequent. Okay, then. Keep it up. Things will improve. She stole a sip of Brock's hot chocolate. So, what are you going to work on while I'm gone? What's your project? The large plate glass window creaked as a gust of wind from outside flexed it invisibly. I don't know. I guess try to keep Zane's work alive. See if I can keep them from knocking down that schoolhouse somehow. Maybe talk to the mayor. Try to get some kind of a law passed. It's what he would have wanted. Is that what you want? She asked. Sure, Brock said. You don't sound too sure. I don't think it's going to work. Doesn't matter, as long as it keeps your mind occupied. Okay, then. Just, if you go talk to my dad, take it easy. Don't get him too worked up. For my sake. And don't get yourself too worked up either. Brock and Wisteria sat silently in the empty restaurant for a bit. Gurley flicked some switches in the back room to turn off the neon open sign and the overhead fluorescent lights. Now the only illumination came from hanging strings of colored Christmas lights that she still hadn't taken down. The blues, reds, greens, whites, and yellows mixing to create a warm amber glow. Romantic, said Wisteria. Shut up, Brock said. He kicked her gently under the table, and she laughed. How's the cat doing? He's good. He quit sleeping upstairs in the attic every night. Now he sleeps at the foot of my bed. So, that's progress. Wow, Wisteria said. He likes you. Not really. He likes food. I put some treats on the comforter every night to lure him into position. Then he keeps my feet warm while I'm sleeping. Wisteria smiled at that. A car pulled up outside. An SUV. Mike's car. Well, that's my ride, Wisteria said. She didn't get up, though. Brock nodded. Are you glad I won't be harassing you for a while? Or what? You gonna miss me? She asked. A laugh escaped from Brock. Yeah, both. I'll miss you. Same, Wisteria said. But I'll be back at spring break, and I'd better not find you living among piles of filth. Fair enough. Wisteria passed a small wrapped present across the table. For you, she said. Brock looked at the box. I thought we agreed not to do the Christmas gifts thing. This isn't a Christmas gift. It's a reminder. And you can't open it yet. So, what do I do with it? Wait until you're feeling like you can't keep up with your new routine. If you think you're going to give up, or if you find yourself slacking off, open it then. There was a honk from outside. Okay, I'd better get out of here. Brock and Wisteria stood and hugged, somewhat awkwardly. Then Wisteria grabbed her parka and darted outside, heading for Mike's vehicle. Brock slumped back into the booth and waited, watching the snowflakes drift and blow. Later, the clock ticked over to 12 o'clock a.m., a new year, but he didn't even notice. In a sterile meeting room on the third floor of the Salamone County Courthouse, lawyers were preparing for a conflict. It couldn't necessarily be called a battle, because mediation is usually more of a gentleman's spat than one of the knockdown, drag-out fights you see on television courtroom dramas. Mr. Brahms and Mr. Courtney, representing the city of Broadacre, sat in the power seats, those chairs with their backs to the walls, facing the door. That way, they could see everyone coming and going, and they would be the first people that anyone saw upon entering. That was the benefit of working on the taxpayer's dime, arranging for the resources of the city to best represent their interests. Mr. Brahms, the elder attorney, was well coiffed and sharply dressed, but not to the same degree as a lawyer from, say, Chicago might have been. His suit was out of fashion by a few years, and his shoes could have been shinier. In a small town, you wanted to impress, but not overwhelm. You never knew when you might run into your opponents again, cutting your hair at the barber shop, teaching at your child's school, or, heaven forbid, preparing your food in a restaurant. Mr. Courtney was the newest attorney in the firm. Not too far removed from law school, Mr. Brahms could see that he was hungry to learn and hungry to win regardless of his lack of experience. This would be a good case to cut his teeth on. Around the long side of the table, in front of the windows that overlooked the courthouse square, sat a number of city functionaries, a stenographer, various insurance agents, an assistant from the coroner's office, Fire Chief Samantha Ellsworth and an assistant, a couple of mid-level managers from the city's Treasury Department, and a few other assorted hangers-on. Opposite the city's hired guns was Samuel Donnelly. Once a respected trial lawyer with a practice in Daleville, he had officially retired at the age of 75 and for the last few years had offered his services as a mediator gratis, as long as he could preside over cases that he found personally interesting. He was large, snowy-bearded, and might have appeared as a jolly Santa figure, if not for his navy suit that was all business, and a mouth that, rather than looking droll and drawn up like a bow, was pulled tight in concentration. The quiet conversation came to an end when the door opened and lawyers for the opposing faction entered. Mr. Montero and Mrs. Nash, the former a Hispanic gentleman in his 40s, the latter a gray-haired woman of about 60, entered and passed around cordial greetings. Behind them, Mrs. Caroline Truax strode purposefully into the room, with her husband close behind. He strode somewhat less purposefully. In fact, he looked a bit like a footman attending to the Queen. Caroline nodded to Mr. Donnelly, and then sat gracefully next to her lawyers. Everyone in the room was searching the faces of Mr. and Mrs. Truax for signs of emotion, in order to know how to react. Gregory looked flustered as he sat, then realized he had left the door open, stood to close it, and banged his thigh on the conference table. Caroline looked serene, magnanimous. Samuel Donnelly's glasses hung on a chain around his neck. He put them on and opened his portfolio. "I think that's everyone," he said. "Let's go ahead and get things started." Brock sat in his truck outside the offices of Hackett and Associates, trying to will his heart to slow down and failing at it. Ever since Wisteria returned to college, he'd kept up with his exercise. Every morning there was a schedule. He began with stairs, climbing all the way from the basement to the attic, and back down again. 10 times. Then 50 push-ups. 100 jumping jacks. 20 minutes on an old exercise bike that he found in the basement. Then, sweating and panting, he would jog 5 laps around the house. Even with snow on the ground, he could hardly feel the cold. His hair would freeze and ice crystals would form in his nostrils. Only after struggling through the final lap would he allow himself to limp back into the house and collapse onto the living room couch, the fluffy, overstuffed one in front of a steaming radiator. Despite the immediate tiredness and sore muscles later, he had to admit that it felt great. And somewhat counterintuitively, he felt more energetic for the rest of the day. That helped him to get through the rest of his schedule. Breakfast of eggs and sausage, coffee, then work on the house for a few hours. Putting together a lunch, usually a sandwich of deli meat and cheese with vegetables. More housework, cleaning, and repairs until quitting time at 5 p.m. Just like a regular job. For dinner, he tended to make something a little more involved. He prepared dishes from old cookbooks that Mrs. Glazer left behind, even working his way up to roasting a whole turkey one Monday that he picked at for the rest of the week. In the evenings, he allowed himself some leisure time. Brock read books, everything that he could find at the old Broadacre Library, about preservation, historic districts, and the laws regarding them. Those books suggested other topics, so he checked out works on city planning, landscape architecture, and art. Anything to occupy his mind and keep his thoughts from wandering to dark places. As he read, he also thought on the best way to approach Robert Hackett about the schoolhouse. Should he take the pragmatic route? Finding some logical way to convince Mr. Hackett that saving the schoolhouse could somehow be a boon to his development? Or should he try to appeal to Mr. Hackett's emotions, pleading with him, telling eloquently of the losses sustained by communities when their historical treasures are lost? It took nearly 3 weeks to figure out a plan and build up his courage, but the day had come. Brock still wasn't sure if he was actually going to go through with it. He could just drive off and no one would know the difference. He worried that he might suffer a panic attack and embarrass himself right there before Robert Hackett in the man's own office. But the rational half of his brain interceded, reminding him that he had been experiencing fewer and fewer attacks since beginning his routine. "I'm not having a panic attack," he told himself. "Panic attacks happen for no reason. This is just anxiety, totally normal anxiety in a stressful situation. I can handle this." He swung the truck door open and stepped out. Probably. Inside the office, Brock approached the reception desk and greeted Kelly, who didn't smile back when she saw. She looked him up and down in a vaguely distasteful way, and he suddenly felt underdressed in his sweatshirt, baggy jeans, and hiking boots. He expected this sort of treatment, being a brown-skinned man in a white people's world, even though he never really got used to it. But he was here for a purpose, and playing the race card would only darken their impressions further. In the lobby, a couple of formally dressed men, one wearing a gray business suit, the other in a black clerical shirt with tabbed collar, trailed off their conversation. Brock recognized the latter as Reverend Terry Cleghorn. He could feel their eyes upon him. "Yes." "My name's Brock DeKalb. I'd like to speak with Robert Hackett, ma'am." "Do you have an appointment?" "I'd only need 10 minutes or so." Kelly tapped a pin against her temple. "He's booked up for the next 2 hours, and then he has lunch after that." "I don't mind waiting. Is there any chance I could speak with him, just for a minute, before he goes off to lunch?" "What's this regarding?" Brock knew this would be a problem. Telling her the straight truth would never work. "I'm a friend of his daughter's, ma'am. I was hoping to ask him about how he got his start in real estate development. Wanted to get some advice. Wisteria thought he might be kind enough to answer some questions." "You know Wisteria?" Brock nodded quickly. "Just had some personal interest in maybe getting into the business myself. Mr. Hackett is kind of like my idol." He cringed inwardly at how cheesy that last part sounded, but Kelly didn't seem to notice. She just sighed. "I'll ask him. Can't promise anything. Have a seat." Brock sank into an oversized chair as Kelly pressed buttons on the phone. A few moments later, she called out, "Mr. DeKalb, Mr. Hackett will speak with you briefly after his meeting." Then she walked Reverend Cleghorn and his associate into Robert's office. Brock sat and waited. He read a 6-month-old copy of some second-tier news magazine, cover to cover, twice. He wished that he had thought to bring one of his library books along, like the one on the complete streets theory for pedestrian and bicycle access. Would have been a good prop to enhance his credibility, too. Oh well. 2.5 hours went by before Robert's office door opened again, and Kelly led Brock inside. Mr. Hackett raised his eyebrows only slightly as he watched Brock enter, but Brock saw it. He knew what it meant. "So, I understand that you know my daughter." "Yes, sir." "From where? School?" "No, my roommate was Zane Truax. We met last year before she went off to college. All of us were good friends." Mr. Hackett's face began to crash. He was starting to put the pieces together. "Okay, well, it's nice to meet you. So, I need to get out for my lunch break. I just have a couple of minutes. You had some questions about the real estate business?" "Actually, sir, I was hoping that we could talk about the one-room schoolhouse and some of the older buildings on the Carterville site." Mr. Hackett narrowed his eyes and said nothing. "I wanted to propose something. Have you ever considered having archaeological studies done on the site before the demolition?" Mr. Hackett continued to stare through Brock. "Or maybe fixing up the schoolhouse and making it a centerpiece of the new development, some sort of living history museum?" "I've taken all of these options into consideration." Mr. Hackett replied grimly. You know, my friend Zane died standing up for what he believed in. He understood the importance of history to the... God damn it, Mr. Hackett interjected. You kids stand up for yourselves and your causes all you want, but I'm sick of this. Brock felt the sudden urge to crawl under his chair. Mr. Hackett jerked the phone from its cradle and punched one of the direct line buttons. It's just Brock tried to connect the thoughts in his mind. It's my property, get your own land, and do what you want with it. But, look, I gave your friend a decent burial, donated a cemetery plot, allowed the family to use the church for a funeral, no charge. And still, you come in here harassing me about this. I'm not... Mr. Hackett spoke into the receiver. Kelly, Mr. DeKalb is on his way out. Please don't let him in here again. He slammed the phone back down and made a waving motion with his hand, as if Brock were a mosquito and Mr. DeKalb were shooing him off. Brock stood in a daze and headed for the door. As his hand touched the handle, he turned once more and spoke timidly. Mr. Hackett? The only reason those buildings aren't already gone is the story floating around about how Zane had been speaking with me, trying to force me to change my mind. How would it look if I'd just gone ahead with the demolition right after he died? And then the snows came, and now everything is behind. When the weather warms up, I will be clearing the site. Brock opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. Get out, said Mr. Hackett. Leave me alone. Brock left. He went home and had a panic attack for the rest of the afternoon. 3 days later, Brock had fallen back into his old ways. Exercise had stopped. Progress on the house had stopped, except for a few half-hearted attempts at staining wood trim. Anxiety was already beginning to return to its old squat, lurking in the dark corners around the edges of his mind. When he saw Wistaria's gift-wrapped package waiting on the kitchen table, he figured that it was as good a time as any to find out what was inside. It was a switch, the power switch, from the broken wire recorder that Zane had dug up the first day they'd met Wisteria, lying on a bed of cotton. A cord had been strung through a hole at the top, making a simple necklace. There was also a note wedged into the box. My friend, it read in a flowery cursive hand, if you're reading this note, then you're struggling. I knew you would get to this point because I am basically psychic. Actually, no. It's because I have been there myself, and since I couldn't be around to kick your ass into gear, I thought this might help. Zane had this switch in his pocket when he died. The coroner gave it to the police gave it to his parents gave it to me. I turned it into a necklace, and have been wearing it for several months now. Whenever I was feeling a little down, I'd touch the switch and it would make me feel better. I'm not sure why. Maybe it has been imbued with special magic powers by Zane's ghost. Maybe it hasn't, and it just reminds me of good times. Maybe those two options are actually the same if you think about it. Anyway, I'm giving the switch to you now. I suggest that you try wearing it. It isn't very comfortable and doesn't really make a very good necklace. The metal bits dig into your skin, but perhaps that will serve as a constant reminder and help keep you on track. It's okay to fall down sometimes. Just get up and start back into your routine and you'll be feeling better in no time. Cliché? Yes. But it's true. I miss you, and I'll see you soon. Yours, Wisteria. Mayor Jimmy Moon sighed as he listened to Brock's story. Just let the kid say his piece, he thought. Then you can have Dorothy hold all your calls for the rest of the afternoon. Maybe lock the office door, even catch a nap on the love seat. That would be fantastic. This kid had been trying for weeks to make an appointment. Mayor Moon asked Dorothy, his secretary, to reschedule at least twice, maybe 3 times. Usually the citizens would just give up and stop calling after the second time you rescheduled. Oh, excuse me, my administrative assistant, he thought. You weren't supposed to call them secretaries anymore. Political correctness run amok, just like the radio pundits were always on about. He sighed again, louder this time. The kid didn't seem to be getting the hint. He was just going on and on about historical preservation, archaeological surveys, changing the laws. Sounded like he was regurgitating some hippie college class. And he kept messing with some little piece of metal on a cord around his neck, like it was a worry stone or something. Kids. So it's very important to get a law passed that would prevent the wanton destruction of historic structures like these, Brock was saying. Right now, there's no protection at all. Developers who buy the land and want to bulldoze everything can do anything without consulting the city, the county, the state. I mean, sure, the Historical Association will contact them and ask for permission to assess the historical and architectural value, but the developer isn't even required to respond. Mayor Moon, uncomfortable, shifted in his chair, the fabric of his pants squeaking loudly as it slid across the leather seat. He leaned forward and gripped the left and right edges of his desk in a practiced maneuver, one that he had performed countless thousands of times during his decades-long tenure. He thought it seemed to indicate that he'd made a decision, and now he would hand down his proclamation. Most of the time, it put the issue to rest. Son, I hear what you're saying, and you're probably right, but that's a decision best left to the next administration. I'm not running for re-election in November, so whoever takes my place would be the person to get legislation passed. Brock's face fell. Can we just go ahead and get the process started? Look, I'm being totally honest with you now. I'm old and tired. That kind of change would take months of preparation and research, lobbying, debate. I'm just not up for that. Come back in a year and speak with the next mayor. But the schoolhouse won't even be there in a year. Hackett Associates is going to knock it down as soon as the weather warms up. And I'm really sorry about that, but there are other historic buildings in Broadacre. Brock touched the talisman around his neck. The cool metal was oddly comforting, just like Wisteria said. He absolutely flipped the switch from the off position to on. Mayor Moon was looking at him expectantly. Do you know about Zane Truax? Brock asked. The mayor nodded. He did know, in fact. The city had recently been involved in mediation with the boy's parents at the courthouse next door, trying to head off a wrongful death lawsuit. Brock continued, his voice wavering a bit. He was a friend of mine. My best friend. We worked on the Hauser's Wood Cemetery restoration project together. So I've heard. That was a great thing that the two of you did, but he gave his life for that schoolhouse. Now, wait a minute, son. I think that description is a little over the top, don't you? If he hadn't been in North Broadacre trying to talk Robert Hackett out of knocking down the old buildings, he'd still be alive. If the buildings had been protected somehow, designated as historic landmarks, he would have had zero reason to be there. This kid. Mayor Moon just wanted Brock out of his office. That's some kind of tortured logic you have there, son. Mayor, do you believe in ghosts? The mayor chuckled. He did believe in the possibility of ghosts. Sometimes, working late into the night, he'd hear things moving around upstairs even when no one else was in the city hall. Heavy, dragging noises in the attic. Muffled voices, too. Once he thought he heard laughter at the end of a dark hallway near the street commissioner's office, and when he'd gone to investigate, no one was there. Sure, there were other explanations. But his grandmother had told him stories all about the haunts when he was a little boy, and they stuck with him ever since. Not really, the mayor said. Well, I saw Zane. After he died. His ghost. It was a lie, Brock knew. But ghost stories could affect people. He'd seen it for himself. The power of belief is strong, even if it's based on a total fabrication. Oh, you did, huh? Brock nodded. I was at the North Broadacre Cemetery, where Zane was buried. Just sitting out there. It was windy. The leaves were dry, blowing all around. All of a sudden, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned around, but no one was there. The mayor leaned back in his chair. When I turned back, there was a misty-looking thing. It came up out of the ground, just like a little puff of fog. That's what I thought it was at first. Fog, but then it moved. It floated toward me, and I got scared. I wanted to get out of there, run away, but I couldn't. I was just stuck to that spot, on the ground with this thing hovering above me. That's very strange, but it doesn't mean you saw a ghost. Well, then I looked right into the mist. It started to change. I could see faces, lots of faces, all melting into each other. There was an old woman and a little girl, a couple of different men in old-timey hats. I saw other things I can't describe. One of them looked like it had a bird face with a long hooked beak. And then I saw another face. I couldn't make it out too clearly, but I knew it was Zane. Brock felt like maybe he was getting too detailed with the story, but he couldn't stop. How did you know it was Zane? Brock cleared his throat, somewhat embarrassed, because he said something that only Zane would know. What did he say? He kind of groaned it. He said, "Ooh, you cock." The mayor looked puzzled. He called you a cock? Brock nodded. Yeah. Like a chicken? Yep, exactly like that. And it rhymes with Brock, so go on. And then he turned slowly to look at the old schoolhouse in the distance. You can see it from the cemetery. He looked and he said, "Save it. The school." The mayor grimaced. Well, that's an interesting story. I think you're full of crap, he said. But look, I'm hungry and I need a nap. Here's what I'm going to do, and this is my final offer. I can talk to the city lawyers and see if they'll put a stay on the demolition. Maybe delay things, tie things up in court for a while. Maybe long enough for you to talk to the next administration about some laws. Now, go home. I have to run. Brock was shocked. Thanks, thank you, sir. I really appreciate this, were the only words he could manage. The mayor marched him to the lobby and he walked outside, dazed, into bright winter sunlight. A week or so later, Brock was wiring a new overhead light into the ceiling at Broadview Manor when there was a pounding on the front door. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had stopped by for any reason. It was a little worrisome. What was going on now? Repossessors? Tax collectors? The police? Brock pulled off his work gloves and shook plaster dust from his hair. The knock. There it was again. He peeked around the corner into the front room. Caroline and Gregory Truax were waiting on the porch. "Brock, we missed you so much, we just couldn't stay away," said Caroline, who swept him up into a hug as soon as he opened the door. "Hope we're not bugging you," said Gregory as Caroline breezed into the house without even an invitation. "Are we bugging you?" "No, not at all," Brock replied. "Come on in." Caroline made herself right at home, inspecting the woodwork, the patched walls, the sanded floors. "This place is looking pretty good." "Thanks," said Brock. "It's getting there." "Much, much better than the last time we were here," said Gregory. "Especially the smell," said Caroline. "Such an improvement." Brock sank into one of the couches that Mrs. Glazer had left behind. He'd thrown a couple of heavy blankets over it to hide the stains, and it was perfectly serviceable as long as no one looked beneath the surface. Gregory and Caroline settled into a love seat. Spooky even made an appearance, darting out from a closet and jumping into Caroline's lap for some scratches. "How have you guys been doing?" Brock asked. "Okay," said Caroline. "Some days are better than others." "Same." Brock was afraid to ask too many questions, potentially dredging up painful memories. Unfortunately, he didn't know where else to take the conversation, so he just watched the cat and smiled. Caroline was scratching under the cat's chin, and Spooky was in heaven. "What a good boy," she said. "You're almost like my grandson, aren't you?" It was silent for a long moment, aside from the cat's deep, throaty purr. Finally, it was Gregory who broke the silence. "So, we didn't come over here just to play with the cat," he said. "As much as we like Spooky." Brock nodded. So, Kenneth Ball wrote a story for the paper about the toxicology report on the fire chief that hit Zane. Gregory took a wad of tissues from his pocket and played with it nervously. "After that, I think every personal injury lawyer in the state of Indiana tried to contact us, wanting to press charges against the fire department or the city or whoever. We had letters, phone calls. We didn't even want to look at them, but then after a little time passed, we got curious." Caroline broke in. "We found a lovely man, Brock. A lawyer. He filed suit against the city." "Of course, we knew it could drag on for a long time," said Gregory. "Maybe years." Caroline nodded. "So, the true goal of the litigation was to encourage the city to settle. We might only get a fraction of the potential award that we'd receive in a trial, but we'd make our point, and then we'd wash our hands of the whole thing." Gregory finished his wife's thought. "Now, we didn't get millions or anything like that, but the city settled for an amount that all parties considered fair." "We paid the lawyer's fees," added Caroline. "We paid the lawyer, yes," said Gregory. "And taxes, and then we had a tidy chunk left over." Caroline took an envelope from her purse and pushed it across the table to Brock. "That's your share," she said, eyes welling with tears. Brock stared at the envelope, not daring to touch it. "No," he said. "What? I can't take this. I can't take money from you. Why?" Caroline nodded. "You were his best friend, Brock. Zane loved you. We love you. We've known you ever since you were a little boy, and you used to come over and play at our house. We watched you grow up. You were like our second son." Gregory peeled a tissue from the crumpled ball and blew his nose. "Zane would want you to have this," he said. "We're leaving it here. It's yours." "No," said Brock. "No, I can't take your money. That's for you." "We have our share too," said Caroline. "That's yours. Zane was helping you to fix up this house. You were letting him live here rent-free in exchange for work, and now he can't do that anymore, and that's a strain on you. So we hope this will help out." So many questions. Why did they bother with a lawyer? Were they all just as bad as those hot coffee spill lawsuit people now? Why didn't they just let it go? Is this what a life was worth when it really came down to it? How much was in the envelope? Maybe it was like $100. Brock thought it would be rude to tear the envelope open in front of the Truaxes and find out. It wasn't like a contract with Zane. I didn't even care if he worked. It was never like that." "I know," said Gregory. "We're not taking it back," said Caroline. "The decision has been made. You take that envelope, you take that money, and you do something good with it. That's all Zane would have wanted." Brock felt a reservoir filling behind his eyelids. He jumped up from the couch and threw his arms around Gregory in a hug to stifle a sob. "You let us come over and visit from time to time, okay?" asked Caroline. "Yeah," said Brock, wiping his face. "Yeah, absolutely." "Okay," said Caroline. "Get the house finished up. Let us know if you need anything." "You're leaving already?" "Yes, we need to head out. We're taking a little time for ourselves. Going on vacation. You take care, Brock." After the Truaxes left, Brock just watched the envelope for a long while. Eventually, Spooky jumped onto the coffee table and batted it to the floor, so Brock had to intervene. He slit the top and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a check, made out to Brock DeKalb, drawn in the amount of $47,000. Later that night, Brock was on his air mattress with the comforter pulled up over his head, not yet ready for sleep. He just couldn't drift off when all the possibilities of what to do with the money were bouncing around his brain. Could he invest it? He really didn't know much of anything about stocks, bonds, and the like. He could put it in the bank. Maybe he could live a simple life, like Zane. Wouldn't have to work for years. But eventually he knew the money would run out, and he had promised Caroline and Gregory Truax that he would do something good with it. Brock needed to generate continuing income somehow. Could he start a company? Buy a franchise? It was a possibility, but he didn't know much about running a business either. What about saving the schoolhouse? That was a good cause. But he knew that Mr. Hackett would never sell to him, and besides, that property was probably worth far more than what he could afford anyway. Crazy schemes began to sprout in his head. What about bribing the mayor of Broadacre to pass legislation? Or getting a lawyer of his own to fight for historic preservation? Paying the demolition team to leave their bulldozers and walk off the job? Hiring a hitman to kill Robert Hackett? Totally ridiculous. Just when sleep began to overtake Brock as he lay curled in his warm cocoon of blankets, the cat snoring softly at his feet, a thought came to him. So simple. A perfect idea. One that would bring everything together. It'd take some work, but he knew that it was within the realm of possibility. At last, he fell into velvet blackness.